Good morning. Welcome back as we study the Gospel of John today. It's been good to be with you today, and I hope you've enjoyed the last couple of weeks. I have taken a couple of weeks worth of sabbatical, so there was no programs last week or the week before because of the week of Christmas. But we're back today, and we're studying John chapter 7. So let me ask you a question as we get started. Do people see you as you see yourself? Now, we're always tempted to say, well, of course they do. I am who I am. And yet perceptions of other people are way off at times. For instance, there's a story I read one time about a boss, for instance, and I'll have to illustrate this a little bit better. He would always go around the office with a scowl on his face, and everybody thought he was angry all the time. Well, one day he came in and he had a big smile on his face and he had new glasses. And it's then that they realized he was not angry all that time. He just couldn't see, so he was trying to squint to see, which caused his face to scrunch up like he was in a scowl. We misinterpret who people are based upon what we see, not about who they are. Now, that's an important principle, especially for the lesson we're going to look at today, because how people see Jesus is what created a difficulty for many of them. And so today we're going to look at three different groups of people and how they did see Jesus through this chapter. The first we find in the first 5 verses of the chapter. It says that after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jewish feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." But then it says, for even his brothers did not believe him. Now, one of the interesting things we know about uh, Jesus and his family is while he was alive, his brothers did not believe him. He had several brothers, two of which we know pretty well because of other places. One is James, who writes a letter that bears his name. The other is Jude, who writes a similar letter toward the end of the New Testament. The problem is when you read those letters, they go, these reflect believers. That's because something happened after the resurrection. And sure enough, when you read in Acts chapter 1, for instance, you find out that when the disciples gather together after the ascension of Jesus and they're waiting for the coming of the Holy Spirit, there is about 100 people there, one of whom is James, the brother of Jesus. There seemed to be this final proof. But as we read this passage, keep in mind that at best, these other brothers were skeptics of his. They wanted something out of him. It says that this was the Feast of Booths. Now, just a few mentions about what the Feast of Booths is. It can sometimes be called the Feast of Tabernacles. It was a feast usually held sometime in the fall of the year after the harvest was done. And it would require the people to build small huts or booths adjoining their houses and move out of the comfort of their houses into these little huts. And the purpose of the Feast of the Booths was to recreate the experience and the feeling of what it was like to be in the desert led by God. They were to remember this. It was one of the 5 great feasts that were required of Jews to attend. There was the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Purim, which we get from the book of Esther, the Day of Atonement, and this one, the Feast of Booths. So this is one in which everybody's flowing to Jerusalem. It's going to be a big crowd there. We know about the Feast of Booths because when Leviticus tells us about it, it tells us this. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, for 7 days is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day you shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord, and on the eighth day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall do no ordinary work. This was an important thing to be done. And so his brother says, this is a required feast. Why don't you go to Jerusalem and to the feast? But Jesus said, but they had a different reason. They said, look, if you really want to be known, if that's your purpose, is to show your stuff, to show how powerful you are, is to tell people you're the Messiah as you seem to be portraying yourself. He said, you need to go down there so you can show it openly. He said, if you want to be known, don't do it in private or in secret. Show it to everybody. Now, that was an interesting concept. Prove it, is what they were saying. Go prove yourself. If you're really who you say you are, prove yourself. You go work all the miracles among all the people, among all the multitudes. Let everybody see you. And then we'll see how that falls out. But Jesus replies to them, and he says, my time is not yet come. It's the same phrase we met in John chapter 2 when Mary asked him to do something about the lack of wine at the wedding feast. He says, it's not my time. My time has not yet come. This is not the first or the only time this is going to come up. It'll come up again in this chapter. The timing is there. The proper season for him to be revealed who he is will occur, but not now. His brothers were pushing him to reveal himself. He said, it's not the right time. He said, you can go down to the feast whenever you want to. But my time has not yet come. I'm not able to do everything you think I ought to do. He said, the world won't hate you because you're just my brothers, but it'll hate me because I testify about what the world is like. Somehow when you point out someone's flaws, they really don't like it, even if what you point out is absolutely true. In fact, sometimes they get more angry if they know it's true. And Jesus is pointing out how the world had shifted away from what God wanted. And so the world and the Jewish system became rabidly crazy about trying to eliminate this troublemaker. My time has not come. And so he tells the brothers, do as you please. I am waiting the timetable of God. I'm listening to a different voice than you are. The next group we meet are the crowds. It does say in John chapter 7 and verse 10 and 11, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, but not publicly, but in private. He went incognito. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? He was the talk of the town. This is the person everybody wanted to see. They wanted to see this Jesus. Who is he? Can he do? They have heard the stories. Now it was time to do what he ought to do. Where is he? Why isn't he here? And so it says they were muttering about him. There's this low rumble that takes place when hushed voices talk to each other. You hear this buzz that kind of comes around, and that's the word, that's the murmur. In fact, in Greek the word has an onomatopoeia sound. It sounds like what it is, a gurgle almost. Blah blah blah. And that's what was happening. They were talking about Jesus, but not very openly because they were afraid of the Jews. Some were saying he's a good man. I think he has something good to say. There are others, on the other hand, that said, no, he is a danger. He is leading people astray. He's taking them down the road that other false messiahs have before as well. And we don't need any more people like him creating problems in our life. Now that's going to come up again and again and again. But you have these two competing ideas there among the crowd. Jesus is a good man to listen to. He's a bad actor who we should avoid. Those two things will play out as we go through the book of John, continuing. And yet no one would say it out loud. No one would stand on a street corner and say, I believe in Jesus. It was too dangerous. The Jewish leaders would have them expelled from the temple, disenfranchised from Judaism. They would lose everything. So they kept it close to the chest. And so it says, beginning with verse 14, about the middle of the feast, in the middle of the 7 days, Jesus went up to the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? There's a lot in that little verse. One, he comes in there and they are just astonished. They are surprised at how he teaches. Just a little bit about how Jews taught. Jews did not teach the way we do, which says this is what the truth is. What they would do is they would quote other people. Now, I have heard preachers do that. They go through a list of commentaries and say, now, brother so-and-so says this, and brother so-and-so says that, and brother so-and-so says that, but you never know what God says in the end. That's kind of what happens. Jesus didn't do that. He said, this is what God says. This is what God wants. Very direct, very precise, without ambiguity at all. He didn't belong to one of the schools. There were two great schools of Judaism at that time. One was the school of Gamaliel, which was the more conservative school, and one was the school of Hillel, which was the much more liberal school. And these were always at a clash, and you always wanted to know, who do you belong to? Who's your teacher? Jesus didn't have a teacher. He didn't need a teacher because he taught it was what was from God, not from the school which he graduated from. And so it says that Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but he who sent me. If anyone will do the will of God, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him and is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law, and yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? Jesus says that what I'm teaching is nothing more than what has been delivered to me. I didn't come up with this. This is not my idea. This is God's idea. And he said, you'll know if you do the will of God that I am telling you the right things. But by inference, he said, but if you're not doing the will of God, you will think it's just coming out of my own authority. He said, now people who speak on their own authority, they want the limelight. They want the glory. But the one who wants the glory of him who sent him is true. They want God to be seen. Jesus, when he preached and when he taught, wanted God to be seen. That's a pretty good standard to live to. No matter what it is, let them hear the voice of God when we say something about Scripture. Not hear the voice of man who wants to be important, who wants to impress. And then he says, but Moses gave you the law, and yet you don't keep it. They had all these circuitous ways to get around the law. And he says, you have the law of God, and yet you won't keep the law of God. So why is it that if you're the lawbreaker, you're trying to seek me to kill me? Maybe you ought to be looking at yourself, is the inference that he makes. So he has an accusation in there buried in something. This is kind of like when you want a dog to take medicine. A dog won't take medicine, even if it's good for them. But if you wrap it in cheese, they're probably going to lap up the cheese and swallow the medicine. Jesus is kind of wrapping this all stuff in an enigma that they're going to have to try to unravel, but it gets into their mind and they're starting to have to think about all these things, having to process it. He's not telling them plainly, he's telling them in a way in which they have to think about it. The crowd said, well, you have a demon. Who's trying to kill you? He said, are you paranoid? That's what we would call this today. Are you paranoid? Who's trying to kill you? You keep thinking people's trying to kill you. I don't understand who's trying to kill you. You must be crazy. He doesn't answer that one. He lets that pass. I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath day. But if on the Sabbath day a man receives circumcision so the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. He says you have this inconsistency. You can circumcise on the Sabbath because you say that's the law of Moses. You can do something that is specifically forbidden for good religious purposes. But he said, if I heal a man on the Sabbath, I have broken the law. Haven't you broken it too? I've made somebody well. You've taken something away. He says, maybe you ought to quit judging from what you can see and start looking through the eyes of God with the right judgment. Look at righteousness. What's the right thing to do, not what appears to be the right thing to do. That's always hard for us because all we have, it seems to be the appearances. But Jesus wants them to continue to think. He's drilling down into their hearts and their lives to do this. But the last group we're going to meet are the Jewish leaders. Now, the brothers are pushing Jesus to prove himself. The crowd is curious about who he is and what he's going to do and what to make out of him. The Jewish leaders have none of that conundrum. They've already made up their mind. Because it says in John chapter 7, verse 25, some of the people of Jerusalem said, is this not the man whom they seek to kill? It was beginning to dawn on people who it was. And he is here speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. The Pharisees and the scribes would walk right past him while he's doing it, and they wouldn't lay a hand on him. Now, if you're trying to kill him, why don't you go ahead and kill him? And then they begin to reason this way. Could it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Isn't it true that if he's not the Christ, they would have seized him? But because they haven't seized him, they must know he's really the Christ. It's really not bad logic, frankly. They said, we know where this man comes from. And when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. He said, we have assumed he's just going to appear. But we know he's from Galilee. See, again, they're struggling. The whole concept here, there's a struggle that's going on. We know something about him, but we don't know all about him. And the Jewish leaders want to kill him, but when they have the opportunity to, they don't. So they must believe something that we don't know. After all, they're smart, and we're not as smart as they are. So Jesus goes on and says, you know me, and you know where I come from. It's no secret. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. He said, okay, you know me. I'm here to tell you about somebody you don't know. He never tells who that is, but they're kind of getting the point because he goes on saying, I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. I am the voice of God. People are beginning to piece together all of these things. And now we come to verse 30, where it says, now they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not come. It was still not the season. There is going to be a moment when the timing is right, when he has shown enough and done enough to where now people have to make a decision about who he is. Remember, the theme of the Gospel of John is, who is this Jesus? And can you believe in him? There is a moment that will come, an hour in which he will be glorified, is the phrase that we'll find out later on. But it hadn't been there, and so nothing had happened. This is operating on God's timetable, not man's. This is not a play in which everybody is operating in the same way. God is shaping the circumstances here. It says, yet many of the people believed in him. And they say, well, when the Christ comes, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? This matches how can anybody do more than he's already done? It's just amazing what he's done. And that could only come from the Christ. But the Pharisees heard all of this. And they decide now is the time to act, so they send officers to arrest him. Let's put a stop to all this right now. And so Jesus says, I'll be with you a little longer, and then I'm going to go to him who has sent me. You will seek me, but you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. More strange enigma. The Jews begin to say, where is he going to go? Where can he go that people can't find him? Is he going to go, say, to Syria or to Egypt or to Corinth or somewhere else that the Jews were dispersed during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes IV to get away from the evil of the times? Is he going to go way out there among those people? Is he going to go to the Greeks? What does he mean when he says, where I am, you cannot come? So it says on the last day of the feast. Remember, you do no ordinary work. It is a feast of convocation. They all gathered together. This is the biggest crowd that they're going to have. And he turns to this whole huge crowd and he says, he said, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. I am the well. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And they understood. He said this about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. In that one statement, he speaks volumes about who he is. Just as he told the woman in Samaria, the woman at the well, I can give you living water and you'll never be thirsty again. He says to these people, I will give you living water. And it's the Spirit of God. No one but God can give his Spirit to people. And yet Jesus is going to give his Spirit. When he said that, some said, this is the prophet. But others said, is Christ come out of Galilee? Has not Scripture said that the Christ will come from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? See, there was something they did not know about Jesus. They said, we know where he's come from. They don't know where he's come from. They assume he was born and raised in Nazareth. That was not correct. He was born in Bethlehem and was raised in Nazareth. So there is this schism, which is the Greek word for that, a division, a schism among the people of him. Is he the Christ or is he not? Big question of John. Is he the Christ or is he not? It says that some of them wanted to arrest him. No one laid their hands on him. There's a seething anger that's beginning to brew. So those officers that were sent by the chief priests and Pharisees went to Jesus, didn't touch him, didn't lay their hands on him. They listened to all of this with big eyes. They said, and so the Pharisees said, why didn't you bring him in? We sent you over there to get him. The officer said, no one has ever spoken like this. The officer was just as amazed as everybody else. There was something so different about it. The Pharisees, have you been deceived too? Have any of us believed in him? We're the ones who would be lining up first to believe in him, wouldn't we? That was not true. Instead, they were saying, those of us who are educated, those of us who know better, we don't buy any of it. And you country bumpkins out there, you can believe any superstition you want. We haven't. But this crowd does not know that the law is accursed. They don't know when he speaks that the law is not being damaged. And then there's this curious little piece in John chapter 7 and verse 50 to 52 about Nicodemus. Nicodemus has an interesting place in the Gospel of John. We met him first in John chapter 3 when he comes to Jesus by night and he says, Teacher, we know that you are from God, for no one teaches like this unless he is from God. And that's when Jesus talks about the new birth. He seems to be interested. We're going to meet him again after this in a different location when we get there. So this is the second of third. Nicodemus is one of those of the ruling council, one of the Sanhedrin, one of the 70 who rule the Jewish ways. He speaks up. Now remember, it says, have any of the Pharisees believed in him? Nicodemus speaks up and says, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? He brought up a procedural point. It would be premature for us to judge him without hearing him. He's correct. But when people are corrupt, they don't want correct. So they said, are you from Galilee too? Are you one of his followers? I want you to look. There's not a prophet that comes out of Galilee. Again, the most learned men in Judaism did not understand a thing about Jesus. Instead, they had closed their minds with blind prejudice. Prejudice means that without any facts, you make up your mind. I always like what Mark Twain said. He said, get your facts straight, and then you can twist them as much as you want. But see, prejudice doesn't do that. It decides what the facts are. It decides what the conclusion is without ever really examining it, and says, this is the truth, and I don't need anybody telling me anything different. That was the Pharisees. That's a modern problem. It was an ancient problem. And so as we come down to the end of this lesson, there are three perceptions about Jesus we've looked at today, and they're still here today. These three perceptions will govern most people. One, Jesus is someone to be manipulated. His brothers tried to get him to do what they wanted him to do. They wanted to say, go prove yourself. We don't believe in you, but we might believe in you if you'll do this. They said, we paid the piper, now you do the dance. And he refused. There are always going to be people who are trying to manipulate Jesus into being what he is not or doing what he is not. They want to make him some sort of a cultural icon. They want to just make him a great teacher. They want to make him a social leader. They'll manipulate Jesus into any shape they want. But it's still manipulation of getting what I want out of you rather than what you are. There's never belief in that. That's why it says his brothers did not believe. Secondly, it says someone of whom you are curious. There are people in this world who are curious about Jesus. They are the prime audience for the Christian message. The question should always be, who is Jesus? That was the one thing that got C.S. Lewis to thinking. C.S. Lewis was an agnostic at best, maybe an atheist, when he met a fellow writer at Oxford, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Tolkien was a Catholic, but he believed in Jesus. He believed in Jesus, he believed in the Bible, believed in God. And he and Lewis would take long walks. But as they took long walks, one of the things he kept asking him is at least look and see. And Lewis began to grow curious about how a man could be a fraud and do what he did, or how a man could be a liar and do what he did. He came to a conclusion: you can only be, if he's a Lord, if he's a liar, don't listen to him, he's lying to you. If he's a lunatic, he's crazy, don't follow him. But if he's the Lord, you better. That's what the curious are looking for. The last is someone to be condemned. The Pharisees had no use for Jesus. He was going to upset their nice little apple cart. They had their system in place. They didn't need him dealing with it and messing it up and changing. They didn't want their power taken away, their position taken away, their authority taken away, their knowledge or lack of exposed. So the best way to deal with that is we're going to condemn him and say he doesn't live with that way. He's not worth anything. Today, there are some people who summarily, without looking, without examining, because of their prejudice, say, I don't want to believe in Jesus. Sad state of affairs, but it's true. The question is, who are you? Are you someone who is uncomfortable with Jesus? So you're just going to push for more proof and more proof and more proof rather than more what has been already written? Are you someone who's curious with Jesus? So you examine what has been said? Or asking that question, who is Jesus? Should I believe in him? Or are you someone who's just prejudiced against him? Someone you just want to silence, that you don't have to hear from anymore? All three run in modern society. The only question is, which one are you or me? Next week, we're going to move on to talk about an interesting little passage about the woman caught in adultery. A passage that has a lot to say and a lot of issues built into it. So I hope you'll join me again next Sunday. And I appreciate you being with me today. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.